In the words of Harriet Tubman, every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember that you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars, to change the world.
We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Because of those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of their horizons, we too dream. The Reverend Barbara Peskin.
Good morning. My name is Mary Grew, and today we celebrate 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment granting American women suffrage. I am honored to begin the true story of bold and brave women, the fight we embraced long ago, and what we accomplished. My name is Mary Grew, and my New England family was financially comfortable and provided me a fine education at Catherine Beecher's Hartford Female Seminary. As I never married, I utilized the time, means, and freedom to pursue my passionate interest in social reform. My first campaign was to end slavery. We moved to Philadelphia in 1834, where I promptly joined a radical abolitionist society. Just 2 years later, I was their corresponding secretary. The night after our interracial anti-slavery convention of American women met in Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Hall, a racist and sexist mob ransacked and burned the brand new auditorium to the ground. Why? Because the hall had been built with anti-slavery contributions. And of course, it was also improper for women to address mixed audiences. Not only did I enjoy writing, I was quite good at it. So I also edited the newspaper Pennsylvania Freeman and was a correspondent for the National Anti-Slavery Standard. Oh, how I despise that cruel, dehumanizing practice. My participation in the meetings of the Philadelphia Female and the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Societies really brought out the fighter in me. Then in 1869, hallelujah, Black men won the vote. I like to think that my articles and speeches may have helped. My work was inspired by what Paul said in the Bible. Remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. Yes, religion was a guiding principle of my life. In fact, my father was a Baptist preacher. But I preferred the Quakers' passion for social reform. And when I discovered Unitarianism, a rational yet spiritual tradition, well, it was a perfect fit. So now I turned my attention to women's rights. Initially, I was working on married women's property and economic rights. Joining the campaign for voting rights was the next natural step. And so I became active with Lucy Stone's new Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association, and in 1869, I was elected its president. I remained the group's president for 23 years. I also joined the Unitarian Society of Germantown. Reverend Charles G. Ames and I attended the National Conference in Boston. In 1873, Fanny B. Ames, the pastor's wife, but a social activist and reformer in her own right. She and I were USG's delegates to and speakers at a Delaware conference. Of course, our Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association tried but failed to get voting rights written into the new state constitution of 1873. I was co-founder of the New Century Club of Philadelphia in 1877, an early influential women's organization with the paramount goal of pursuing suffrage. We also established evening vocational classes for working women. In 1888, I addressed the meeting of the International Council of Women in Washington, D.C., commemorating the 40th year of the Seneca Falls Convention. It was clear that some of us very aged ladies would not live to celebrate the emancipation of women. So I bequeathed that responsibility to the young activists, and I said, be faithful unto death or victory. Proudly remaining at the helm of the New Century Club, in 1892, I had to retire because of my health. I was almost 80 years old, and unlike Fanny Ames and Olympia Brown, would not live to see us finally win the vote in 1920. Yes! And yet, we women are not finished, are we? The Equal Rights Amendment is still not law after 47 years. So again, we know you must gather your intellect, strength, and energy, aiming it sharp and true toward new victories for women. Thank you.
Good morning. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery in New York in 1797, escaped her captors in 1826 and became a prominent New England preacher, lecturer, abolitionist, and women's rights activist until her death in 1883. She spoke at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention at the Old Stone Church in Akron, Ohio, where she delivered one of the most recognized speeches in American history. Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much when I could get it as any man, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's it they call? Yes, intellect. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. if the first woman God made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men had better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
We are dancing Sarah's circle. We are dancing Sarah's circle. We are dancing Sarah's circle. Each and every one. Here we seek and find our story. Here we seek and find our story. Here we seek and find our story. Each and every one. We will all do our own naming. We will all do our own naming. We will all do our own naming. Each and every one. Every round a generation, every round a generation, every round a generation, each and every one. On and on the circles moving, on and on the circles moving, on and on the circles moving, each and every one.
Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a 19th century African American political activist, poet, and novelist. I'm an advocate for freedom and equality for everyone, speaking for the anti-slavery societies before the Civil War and for women's suffrage and temperance movements after. I'm not well known by some, so let me tell you a little more about myself. I was born in 1825 in Baltimore to free Black parents. But my parents died when I was young, so my uncle, William Watkins, a teacher at the Academy for Negro Youth and a radical political and civil rights, raised me. He was a major influence on my political, religious, and social views. After I left school at 13, my first poems were published in abolitionist periodicals, such as Frederick Douglass's Paper. And at 20, my first book of poems, Forest Leaves, was published. In 1850, I was the first woman to teach at Union Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio. Later, I taught in Pennsylvania while living in an Underground Railroad station. There, I witnessed the workings of the Underground Railroad and the movement of slaves toward freedom. I was drawn into public life when sexist laws left me destitute after being widowed. I formed alliances with strong figures in the feminist movement, including Susan B. Anthony. In 1866, I gave a speech before the National Women's Rights Convention demanding equal rights for all, including Black women. I was one of the founders of the American Women's Suffrage Association. We believed that opening the vote to Black men was key to expanding the franchise and planned to work state by state on women's suffrage. I made several tours of the South during pre-emancipation to observe the conditions of the enslaved, and then during Reconstruction to document the ways families were adjusting to freedom. I helped organize the National Association of Colored Women and was elected a vice president. In a speech at the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, I described our nation as needing a keener and deeper, broader and tenderer sense of justice, a sense of humanity, which will crystallize into the life of the nation the sentiment that justice, simple justice, is the right, not simply of the strong and powerful, but of the weakest and feeblest of all God's children. A deeper and broader humanity, which will teach men to look upon their feeble brethren not as vermin to be crushed out, or beasts of burden to be bridled, but as the children of the living God, of that God whose most earnest hope is in perfect wisdom and in perfect love, working for the best good of all. I wrote a novel, Iola Leroy, which was published in 1892. The book, like my career, intertwined the issues of racism, classism, and sexism that otherwise may not have been recognized as related and intersecting. It is one of the first novels published by a Black woman in the United States. At the 100th anniversary of Iola Leroy, African American Unitarian Universalists commemorated the occasion by installing a new headstone on my grave at Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania, to replace the old one which had endured the inroads of time. You see, I was a Unitarian too. I worked with Unitarians in the abolition movement and in the Underground Railroad. I was a member of both First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia and Mother Bethel AME Church. I wouldn't choose. So, you can see my headstone and my home at 1006 Bainbridge Street. It has a historic marker. And listen to this. There's going to be a statue of me in the capital of this state. That's right. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania commissioned a public installation called A Gathering at the Crossroads with life-size figures of four great abolitionists, William Howard Day, Jacob Compton, Thomas Morris Chester, and me, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. We exemplify the period's great orators who impacted the change makers in Harrisburg's African American community. The dedication is planned shortly, August 26, 2020. My legacy endures.
We send our deepest sympathy to Susan Bacchius and her family as they gather together to support each other after her daughter Rebecca's sudden death. Our thoughts are also with Peggy Kalish, who is recuperating from a stroke at the Abramson Rehab Center. Peggy's sister Lynn reports that Peggy may be returning home this week. We look for ways to support those who are struggling with health concerns or facing challenges to meet their essential expenses. We are mindful of school children, their parents, and teachers and other school employees who are facing so much uncertainty in the coming school year. And we greatly appreciate the people who have striven for centuries to help people gain the right to vote, and those who are working now to assure that everyone has the opportunity to exercise that right.
Thank you. I'm Olympia Brown. I'm from the Universalist side of the UU coin. You may know me as the first woman ordained by a denomination. I was born in 1835 in Michigan to pioneer free-thinking parents who worked hard to get me an excellent education, and I loved it. I got my bachelor's degree at Antioch College in 1860, and I went on to study theology at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. When I heard Antoinette Brown, not relation to me, preach at the college in 1862, oh, I knew this was my calling. I began ministry in 1864 at a Universalist church in Weymouth, Massachusetts. It went well. And shortly thereafter, these dear people granted me a 4-month leave of absence to campaign in Kansas to change the state constitution and eliminate the word male from its definition of voter. I gave 300 speeches in 4 months, and we lost. But this was a beginning for me of working both deeply at committed parish ministry and to social justice. As I wrote, freedom of religious thought and a liberal church are the groundwork for all other freedoms. I continued in 2 succeeding Universalist ministries, Weymouth Landing and one in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Now, at the Bridgeport Church, I met my dear John Henry Willis, husband of some 20 years and father of our 2 children. I hadn't sought marriage. I wasn't sure it was the right path for me. But in John, I met one of the best and truest men that ever lived. His unflinching support made our lives work. After 9 years and success in the Universalist parish in Racine, Wisconsin, I shifted my focus to women's rights. At the Wisconsin Suffrage Association, at the National Women's Suffrage Association, and then in 1890 at the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. There were problems in the national organization. The outreach of our club of educated white women had ignored the great number of women working in factories and on farms, and had left Black women to fight through their own separate organizations. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's newly published Woman's Bible alienated young activists. I found the approach of the new president of NAWSA, Carrie Chapman Catt, divisive and morally flawed. Her rants implied that the waves of immigrants the U.S. was experiencing were not as worthy of the vote as American women, nor were the Native American males who could vote when women couldn't. We didn't have to belittle others to achieve our goals. The second generation of leadership of our national organization was floundering. That's why I was delighted when in 1913 I was invited by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, 2 of the more radical feminists on the planet, to be a charter member of the newly formed National Women's Party. The exact words of my response to their invitation were, "I belonged to this party before I was even born." Now, it may be surprising to some that a 78-year-old woman would join a newly formed organization of militant radicals. I had worked for this cause for most of my life, but this National Women's Party was the right time and the right strategy. I demonstrated in freezing rain and bitter cold. When President Wilson traveled to Europe and talked about bringing democracy to European countries, I personally burned a copy of his speech in front of the White House, and I cried out that he owed democracy to the 20 million women in the United States. I might have been a little old lady, but I wasn't going to sit home and act like one. In 1919, I voted for the first time in a national election at the age of 85. And I said a prayer for all the women who had fought for the privilege and not lived to see the day. I've come back to you today, fellow UUs, fellow believers, to remind you, dear friends, stand by this goal. Work for it and sacrifice for it. Every generation must commit anew. And thank you.
I am Ingrid Brown, a member of USG since 1966. I came to this church the first time the Sunday after Jim Reeb died, March 14th, 1965. I hoped they would talk about him, and they did. I never left. Jim Reeb died as a martyr and as a Unitarian saint, dying for his beliefs. I've called Jim the guiding light in my life. And why is that? October 25th, 1958, I arrived as an immigrant from Germany. I had $50 and finding work was #1 priority. At the Y at 14th and Arch, I inquired about rooms and also mentioned I was looking for a job. The person at the desk said, "Oh, Jim is looking for a secretary." She called his office and handed me the phone. A booming voice came on. "Hi, Ingrid, this is Jim." I was shocked because in Germany, you don't call anyone by your first name without having met them first. From City Hall, I found my way to the West Philadelphia Y, and Jim hired me on the spot. 5 days after arriving in Philadelphia, I had a job. The following year, April 3rd, 1959, Jim married Bob and me. Was this divine guidance? How can there be such luck to meet Jim Reeb and he having trust in this greenhorn? Who was Jim Reeb? He was born January 1, 1927 in Wichita, Kansas. After college and Princeton Seminary, Jim's first professional position was as a chaplain at the Philadelphia General Hospital. It was during this time that his leanings to the free thinking of the Unitarian Church developed. During the years of waiting to be accepted into the Unitarian ministry, Jim held a position as a youth director at the Y in West Philadelphia at 52nd and Sansom. For the rest of his life, work with inner city youth was his almost exclusive focus. His first calling as ministers to All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., where he was also ordained. Jim was less happy preaching than being involved with work with inner city Negro youth. This calling brought Jim to a position with the Society of Friends and a new program involving housing integration and youth work in Boston. The family had only moved there the fall of 1964, obtaining housing in Roxborough, the Negro section of Boston, and the children went to the local public schools. This work was cut short by Jim's death in Selma, Alabama. The Selma marches were long in the planning by Martin Luther King and his organization. On Sunday, March 7th, hundreds of marchers were stopped and beaten with billy clubs by state troopers and militiamen on horseback, well organized by the Selma sheriff. At the end of the day, Dr. King called on all ministers of the country to come to Selma to march with him. Jim Reeb and his wife Marie saw the news report on the Sunday night television. He told her he needed to go. They knew the risk. She said, "I don't want you to go, but I know you need to go." They scrambled for cash for the plane ticket to Montgomery, Alabama for the next day. Jim joined other ministers and marchers at the Black Church Tuesday, and because of so much national presence, there was no violence. Not having eaten for 24 hours, Jim and his fellow Unitarian ministers, Clark Olson and Orloff Miller, went to a recommended integrated restaurant. Jim called his wife to report that all went well. As the three ministers were leaving the restaurant, they became aware of being followed. 4 white men with clubs beat upon the ministers. Jim was hit on the head with a club and fell to the ground. There was much delay of getting to the hospital in Birmingham, which included a flat tire of the ambulance. 2 brain surgeons performed brain surgery, but on March 11th, with all hope gone, life support was disconnected. President Johnson sent yellow roses to the hospital and called him this good man. President Johnson, sent U.S. Air Force planes to bring his wife Marie from Boston and his father from Casper, Wyoming. Jim left 4 underage children, and he was 38 years old. The murder of Jim Reeb was a pivotal point in President Johnson's delivering the draft of the Voting Rights Act on March 15, 1965. Martin Luther King eulogized Jim Reeb this way, quote, "James Reeb symbolizes the forces of goodwill in our nation. He demonstrated the conscience of the nation. He was an attorney for the defense of the innocent in a court of world opinion. He was a witness to the truth that men of different races and classes might live, eat, and work together as brothers. James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike. Says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life."
55 years later, the march led by Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, is still regarded as a memorable moment in the struggle to advance civil rights in America. But as recent events have made clear, the Selma March was only one chapter in a much longer and older story about the nation's original sin of slavery. It's a story that brings to mind a famous observation by Marcel Proust. The more things change, the more they stay the same. My participation in the Selma to Montgomery March covered only the last 10 miles into Montgomery, and it came about without any advanced planning on my part. A senior partner in my law firm by the name of Henry Sawyer, well known for his pro bono work in civil rights cases, stuck his head in my office one morning and said that he had 3 round-trip tickets on a charter flight from Philadelphia to Montgomery, leaving the next morning. He said the flight would get there in time for us to walk the last 10 miles of the 5-day march from Selma, ending in front of the State House, occupied by the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. A speech was to be given by Martin Luther King. Henry invited me, along with Pat Ryan, another young partner in our firm, to join him on the trip. It all sounded pretty exciting, and we both jumped at the chance. When we arrived in Montgomery, we found that the rallying point for the last day of the march was an enormous field on the outskirts of town, where a huge crowd was assembling. A concert had been given the night before, featuring Harry Belafonte and other stars of the day, so we were not really too surprised to find ourselves walking just behind the folk-singing trio of Peter, Paul, and Mary. The weather was quite warm. Everybody was given a plastic bottle of water to keep us hydrated. As for the march itself, I particularly recall the odd experience of walking through nearly deserted streets of Montgomery, watched only by fully armed soldiers of the Alabama National Guard. They had been called up by Governor Wallace to control what he called a mob of outside agitators who had invaded his city. Now, in truth, I don't actually remember very much about the content of Dr. King's speech that day, other than his closing responsive refrain. How long? Not long. To the question, when could Negroes reach the promised land? Back at the airport, I do recall sitting with Henry and Pat at a small table outside a bar with a friendly waitress who asked us where we came from, and when we said we were lawyers from Philadelphia, she assumed we were in town on business, but asked if we had heard about the unruly mob marching from Selma. She said she could tell they was all drunk, because she saw on TV the plastic bottles everybody carried and concluded that the bottles were full of gin. We solemnly assured her that we had not seen any public drinking, but I confess that we did have a couple of martinis on the return flight to Philadelphia. At the time, we were unaware of the tragic events that were occurring that day. We did not know anything about Jim Reeb, nor did we know that Viola Liuzzo, a 39-year-old mother of 5, who had driven from Detroit to help protect black civil rights and was shot and killed by Ku Klux Klansmen as she drove toward Montgomery to pick up a carload of marchers. But of course, the full impact of the march became clear 12 days later, on August 6th, when President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So, Marcel Proust is not always right. Sometimes it seems the more things change, they don't always stay the same. Things do change, and they can change for the better. Thank you.
Please hold tight, everybody. We lost our worship associate from the meeting for a moment. We're getting her back in.
This beloved community is a source of acceptance, support, and hope to all of our members and friends. Please be as generous as you can as we gratefully receive the offering for the ongoing work of our community. Instructions for donating electronically will be provided to you in a slide. Contributions can be texted to the number 215-608-2660. To contribute to the Sunday collection, send a text with the amount of your gift, followed by a space, and the word "Son." To contribute to the USG COVID Relief Fund, send a text with the amount of your gift, followed by a space, and the word "COVID." To contribute toward your 2020-2021 annual pledge, send a text with the amount followed by a space and the word "pledge." You can also make a gift through the online payment center at usguu.org/give. We are very grateful for your support.
Hi, now we're going to sing Bread and Roses together. And we're going to start on an F sharp, which is a good starting place for me. Being a mezzo, I never know what key I sing my songs in, so I just start with the note that makes the whole thing comfortable for me. So sing along. As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, a thousand mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our days shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we come marching, marching, outnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty, their trudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we come marching, marching, we bring the greater days. The rising of the woman means the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler can that toil while one reposes, but the sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses.
The preamble of the United States Constitution states, "We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." In the Oxford English Dictionary, the word perfect is defined as good as it is possible to be. Why then did the drafters of the Constitution use the words, "a more perfect union"? Clearly, they were educated men, fully knowing the meaning of the word. I would like to think they used that specific language because they understood the infancy of the union they formed and realized this union would need to go through childhood and adolescence before coming into the maturity of full adulthood. Their power vested in each succeeding generation, who through growing pains, strife, bloodshed, and civil war, evolved to emancipate the enslaved and grant suffrage to women and those not considered white. That power is now vested in us to continue the work of forming a more perfect union, to bring this nation to full maturity. Join us next Sunday as we continue to celebrate the centennial of a women's right to vote, carry forward the revolution begun in 1776, and embrace the call to collective evolution.
One more step, we will take one more step, till there is peace for us we'll say one more word till every word is heard by everyone. We'll say one more word, one more prayer. We will say one more prayer till every prayer is shared by everyone. We'll say one more prayer, one more song. We will sing one more song till every song is sung by everyone. We'll sing one more song.
No country can ever truly flourish if it stifles the potential of its women and deprives itself of the contributions of half its citizens. Michelle Obama.